come back in an hour, and it'll be posted, hopefully. So, Revelation, we're going to be looking at chapters 15 and 16 this morning. It's good to have everyone here this morning. Love to see at least one side of the room here is filled up. That's pretty good. That's the start. So, let's back up a little bit and get some context for what we're trying to talk about. Beginning in chapter 12, we have these visions of a radiant woman. We have a woman who is being chased by the great red dragon. And those were called signs. Signs. So John is portraying an event, but he's also telling us it's a sign. So we have a problem in our society today, and I don't mean like I'm just going to start shaking a stick at everybody. You have this problem, you have this problem. No, all of our problem in Western society, in Western culture, is metaphor is starting to die out because we like being what's called literal. And so we ask, is it real? Well, that's a loaded question. Did it really happen? Well, John saw something. I don't know if it was made up of atoms or not, but we get in this mindset for the last 200 or 300 years of this post-enlightenment, that we can figure everything out if we just try hard enough and drill down deep enough. We can figure out exactly the mechanism of everything in the world. And sometimes we need to back up and just look at the poetry of what's going on to understand the situation. All of language is contextual, first of all, and all of language is metaphorical. Notice I said all. That means every single word of every single everything. That word all in itself is a metaphor for something. It represents something, right? That's how languages work. And so we get this sign, John tells us, of this woman and the dragon. And John now sees another great and marvelous sign in chapter 15. And so signs point beyond themselves. They show us the theological meaning of what's going on. They don't just point to a specific time or event or place in history. They show us the meaning of history. This is what I was trying to get to when I asked the question when we were talking about Genesis. What makes a house different than a home? We are constantly looking at the bones of the house and how this is put together and nails here, and that's fine. But if you miss making that a home, then you haven't really lived. And so signs point beyond themselves to show us the meaning of history. And here we have 7 angels and 7 plagues that is trying to communicate to us the certainty and the completeness of God's wrath on all evil and all unrighteousness. And so these plagues, these bowls that are going to be poured out are great, and they're tremendous, and they're awe-inspiring, and they have this effect on us, but they also have this effect on nature and all of the human race, and especially we're going to find out the 7th plague on the kingdom of Babylon. And so in chapter 16, we're going to see the story of those plagues happen. And it's going to move along kind of like when we're singing the song, and you see me in the beginning, we start off on a nice pace, and then as we get towards the end, we oftentimes in our culture, the songs build up and they get louder and they crescendo. This story is going to crescendo. It starts out with these sores that are on the skin, and then water to blood, and scorching sun, and moving to an earth god, to a world that refuses to repent. And it's no longer a warning anymore because, as John says, the wrath of God is finished in chapter 15 and verse 1. The wrath of God is finished. The only thing that remains is for this judgment to be finalized. And so the plagues anticipate this pouring out of divine justice but they're met with blasphemy from people who are like Pharaoh. So these bowls that represent plagues are like, the people respond to them like Pharaoh responded to the plagues, and their heart is hardened. They harden their own hearts against God, it says at the end of chapter 16 in verse 21. And so, I want to give the life lessons right up front. Normally, I save this to the end of the lesson, but I want to give them right up front because I want us to be thinking in these terms as we read through the chapter. And I'm going to pick on Clint because he said it during the class, but he said, we were trying to answer the very first question, and he said, man, I just don't quite get this. And so I want to give the meaning up front so that we don't make it, 15, 20 minutes into the lesson here and not realize what's going on. I don't want you to be lost. I want you to know right up front what we're looking for. And what we're looking for is the purpose of this long list of bowls. And so the purpose of this long list is to impress the reader with this huge flow of trade that pours into Rome. Right? So we have God's judgment. Sorry, I got ahead in my notes. So, the life lessons for us, the first one is that God's judgments are righteous. We're going to be seeing these judgments here in Revelation chapter 15 and 16, and they're going to be starting. And those judgments are righteous, and if we jump over to chapter 18, we can see some of those judgments. Chapter 18, and starting in verse 11 through verse 13. I know I have it on the slide behind me, but I want to read it here out of my book because I have some notes. Chapter 18 and verse 11. And this is not even the beginning of what's going on. This is not even the full list of what's in chapter 18 that God is going to judge Babylon for. It says, then the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn because no one buys their cargoes any longer. And there's a big long list of gold and silver and jewels and pearls and fine linen. And at the end of that list is human slaves and human souls are the cargo that these merchants, the merchants of Babylon, deal in. And so the purpose of this long list is supposed to be impressing on us the tremendous flow of trade that went into Rome. This enables Rome to live luxuriously as the mistress of the world, that everybody wants to be with her. And so the word translated slaves here in chapter 18, in many modern versions, is translated as bodies. The slave traders regarded the cargo as merchandise to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. And I saw one estimate of slavery in the Roman Empire that it was as high as 60 million slaves. We're talking in a world that didn't even have 100 million people in it. This is how many slaves there were in the Roman Empire. We're talking like over half of the population was slaves. And so the final item on the list is we have slaves, and then we have the souls of men. And this is a really old Hebrew phrase that means essentially human livestock. And that human livestock refers to the slaves that are destined for the amphitheater, for the Colosseum, for death, or for people who wished that they were dead, for prostitution. And so these are truly evil people committing truly evil acts. And when God judges those people, his judgments are righteous because he's putting an end to those actions. So God's judgment is righteous, and God's judgment is going to come like a thief, he says in verse 15 of, got to be chapter 16, because there's not 15 verses in 15. So he says, behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen and exposed. And so no nation ever thinks that they're going to fall. But God's judgments come like a thief. No world power views themselves as being able to be taken over by another. But history has shown us that nation after nation has risen and then fallen. And so we always need to be prepared to remain true, not to a flag, but to Jesus. Because even if it becomes time for our own nation to fall, to receive judgment for its sins, we need to remain true to Christ. Sometimes we often think, and especially in the last 100 years, this has been a really popular thought, that America is somehow the hand of God, that we go around the world being the hand of God. And I'm not saying that we don't do good things around the world, but sometimes we view ourselves in place of God. And sometimes we think that God wouldn't judge the United States as harshly because he views us favorably. But John tells us that his judgments come unexpectedly. And so God's final judgment will come like a thief. And we have to be prepared to remain faithful to the Lamb in the face of any sort of national calamity. We need to make sure that our true faith is to God first. And we have to also be ready to be prepared for the return of Jesus when he comes. So that's the lesson that comes out of this. Now let's get into what's going on. So if we back up again, let's flash back again. There were 7 seals, and the judgment was revealed in chapter 6 through 8, especially in chapter 7 when we see the seals given. And so Revelation portrays the judgment of God in these groups of 7. And there are 3 main groups of 7, but there are many other groups of 7, just like there are groups of 7 in Genesis. There are 7 angels in between the 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets. There's 7 signs in between the 7 bowls and 7 trumpets. So there's lots of 7s here. And so the visions of judgment that we see here need to be taken seriously, because judgment accounts for nearly half of the book of Revelation, right? And these visions are symbolic. We talked about that already. They're not literal in the sense that John is participating in these events himself, except spiritually. And so we will never see a white horse with a rider who has a sword sticking out of his mouth, right? These are symbols that are supposed to tell us things. We're never going to see birds that are physically gorged on human flesh, on the fallen warriors, like we see in chapter 19, right? Those descriptions are not descriptions of what we would call real occurrences. These are symbols of the real occurrences. And so the message that John is trying to convey to us is through the symbolism of these symbols. And that message is that evil will most assuredly be overthrown. And so these 3 visions of judgment here in Revelation create this emotional experience of shock and awe. Their primary purpose is not to make us fear, but their primary purpose is to be a wake-up call for us. A wake-up call for those of us that are sleeping. Not just simply sleeping through life, but sleeping through the evil of empire and saying, they're not me. I'm just going to be over here. Okay, God calls us to be active. Of course, we have the famous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that happen in these 7 seals, and they seem to represent this chain of events that, unfortunately, what's the word I'm looking for? That this chain of events that is tragically just another day in human history. There's the lust of conquest by these empires. They see, they want, and they take. It's the same pattern from the garden. They see, they want, they take. Because of that, there is the breakdown of peace in the second horseman. There's death in war and economic injustice that leads to famine and disease That is exactly what is happening today. And so we see another cycle of these events, these four horsemen of the apocalypse, happening even in our day. This is not the ultimate fulfillment in our day, most likely. Most likely, some country will try and do this again, right? So then we move on to the seven trumpets. And the seven trumpets and the seven bowls are similar. In Revelation 8 and 9, and also in our text this morning in chapter 16, they draw on these historical events and these cultural realities that the people had. And they use those things to depict the judgment of God. John is using the words of his day to represent the judgment of God. And the most obvious source of that cultural relevance is the Exodus plagues here that come from the book of Exodus. But there's other biblical accounts of judgment that John will use the language from to describe what's going on. And one of them comes from my own namesake, from the book of Joel. We have the locusts that come in the book of Joel. And so those things also sort of factor into the imagery. And so John has taken some of his generation's worst fears, the worst fears of war and natural disasters, and he's blown them up to what we now call apocalyptic proportions, right? These huge proportions that John is then going to take these images and mold them and use them in biblical allusions to describe what he's seeing. And now the point is not to predict a particular sequence of events in a particular time period in history. The point here is to evoke and to explore the meaning of the judgment. Remember, we're not building a house here on a timeline. We're building a home. We are exploring the meaning of judgment for the sinful world around us. And so the most significant difference between the trumpets and the bowls is the scope of the bowls. The trumpets, all of them, almost all of them were 1/3 of whatever died. Here we have in chapter 16, all of everything dying. In verse 3, it says, all of the sea creatures. At the end of the book, fire from the sun is poured out on all of mankind. How can you survive these things? But we do see survivors. And so these are symbols that are trying to show us. And so we can't forget the most famous bowl, right? The sixth bowl that talks about Harmageddon or Harmageddo or Armageddon, depends on what version you have. And there's been tons of speculation throughout time regarding this battle. But this is the most important line. If you don't remember anything about Armageddon, remember this. Revelation only mentions this one time in passing. This is not what's going on here. And so the place name, Mount of Megiddo, is just a simple city where lots of Old Testament battles took place. It's nothing more than a logical setting for this symbolic battle against cosmic powers. So let's jump into chapter 15. The first two verses of chapter 15 kind of turn our attention back to the throne room of heaven. It's like somebody snaps in a movie and the picture changes to a different scene. And this new sign appears, and John sees that this sign is great, and he sees this sign is amazing, and he sees 7 angels with 7 plagues. These are the last of the judgments. Once these judgments are completed, the earth will be at rest. And so we don't have any more 7s in judgment, because when God's wrath is finished, it will be finished with the 7th bowl. And so we see standing beside the sea of glass, or standing on the sea of glass, depending on what version you have, those who had conquered the beast and conquered its image, the image of the beast, Babylon, and the number of his name. And conquering doesn't come by military might. It doesn't come by the United States defeating Iraq or Afghanistan or Germany or any of those images. That's not how conquering comes here. It comes by remaining faithful to the Lamb, just like the 144,000 of chapter 14, who are singing the same song. It's even called the same song, the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb. And so the door of the temple is opened again, and we see the 7 angels each receiving this bowl of wrath. The wrath of God, and the bowls of wrath is an image that is not new to us, or shouldn't be new to us. Isaiah uses this at least twice in his prophetic book. And he's describing God's wrath that's coming to punish the sinners. And Isaiah, his bowls of wrath would have been poured out on Babylon. So John is using that same symbology here. And so the sanctuary, the temple, is filled with smoke because God is about to act. Let's look in Exodus chapter 40 real quick. Exodus chapter 40 is where we're going to look right this second. It's in the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 40 and verse 34 and 35, and I'll read it here. It says, now we have to remember where we're at, right? The end of Genesis, they haven't left Egypt, right? And at the end of Exodus, they haven't left Sinai. You see, there's a similarity there. Now, let me read this. It says, Exodus 40, 34, and 35. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord, that's the Hebrew word there is the Shekinah, filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And so something is expected. They've now built the tabernacle, right? The end of Exodus, they build the tabernacle, but they can't go in it, right? Flip the page, one page over. What's the next book after Exodus? Leviticus, that's right. Leviticus is how to get into the temple, the tabernacle. It's by purifying yourself, because you cannot come in the presence of God without being pure. Flop to the end of Leviticus, and what do we have at the end of Leviticus? These are the commands which the Lord commanded Moses for the sons of Israel at Mount Sinai. Still at Mount Sinai. We haven't left. Moses, at the end of Exodus, hadn't gone in to the tabernacle. Leviticus is all about how to get in. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness in Sinai, in the tent. So Moses is now inside the tent. So now we see the progression of what's going on here. This imagery that John is using, this cloud of smoke here is there because all of the earth is evil and hasn't been purified. It now needs to be purified, not through the Levitical code, not through Leviticus, but through the Lamb. And the Lamb, and eventually the Lamb's justice, when he comes, the rider on the white horse, to put an end. Bowls of wrath on the earth. This is starting in chapter 16 of Revelation now. And we read that these bowls of wrath are similar to the plagues that are poured out in the days of Moses. And so these first bowls, the first bowl brings out these harmful and painful sores, right? And those who have the mark of the beast and worship the image. And this is very similar to the boils that show up in Exodus chapter 9. The second bowl that we see turns to the sea to blood. So we have the water similar to the water to the blood. Reminds us of the Nile turning to blood in the Egyptian plagues in Exodus chapter 7. Now the third bowl turns the rivers and the springs to water. It's sort of combined with the Nile imagery there. And so the second and the third bowls probably picture some sort of economic devastation that God's wrath will incur. Remember, in the days of Moses, the people were thirsty because they couldn't drink the blood. But also, all these living creatures that were in the water were dying. So there's a devastation, this desert that suddenly has a river flowing through it can't use the river anymore. And so it's devastating when they don't have water anymore. And one of the reasons for this judgment is given there in verses 5 through 7. They are killing God's servants. And so this justice is then deserved. And the fourth bowl pours out pain on the worshipers of the beast. Rather than repenting, though, these people curse God. And they did not repent or give God the glory. And so the judgments continue. And just like when we saw in the seals, and just like when we saw in the trumpets, these bowls can be separated roughly into 4 plus 3. So the first 4 seals and the first 4 trumpets and the first 4 plagues are all similar in some way, not to themselves, but to the group. And so the first 4 plagues have been plagues relating to the physical creatures, to the land. And the next 3 are going to be ones that deal with political themes. And that's going to carry us through the end of the book, all the way through the end of the book. And so we have the 7th bowl that won't even be completed until we get to the end of chapter 20. So the 5th bowl pours out its judgments on the throne of the beast, it says. It's lights out for the Roman Empire in this context for John. John would have seen the beast as being the Roman Empire. And so the kingdom is, is then plunged into darkness. The day in the sun is over. And rather than repenting, the people curse God and do not repent. And the 6th bowl is the first bowl that really kind of gives us any sort of details. These other bowls are really, really short, the descriptions on them, shorter than any other one description is in the book. Because John is trying to focus on the 6th and 7th bowl. And the 6th bowl dries up the river Euphrates. And this is the imagery of coming war. Because somebody else in history dried up the river Euphrates. Anybody remember who that was? It's when Babylon was conquered. Getting close. He diverted the river Euphrates, and his name was Cyrus. And he defeated Babylon. And we can find that the record of that. It's predicted in Isaiah 11. It doesn't come about until much later. But the kings coming from the east sort of has this prophetic expectation of destruction. So the 6th bowl envisions the nation coming, or the nations, plural, coming from the east for battle. And so now we have the 7th plague. And we see, well, let me back up and explain Armageddon real quick. We see the assembling of these kings of the earth to this place called Armageddon, and it's the only place in Scripture where the word Armageddon occurs. I want to make that plain. There's been many false teachings that have been made about this event of Armageddon. However, the only thing that is revealed here in Revelation is that this is the place where they all gather together. The text doesn't even say there's a battle going to happen there. But how many times have you heard the great battle of Armageddon? It doesn't even happen here in Revelation. It doesn't even say it's going to happen here. And so there's been so much ink and spilled, written about this event that hasn't ever happened and isn't even predicted to happen. So when we put all these images from the Old Testament together, we get 2 Kings chapter 9 with King Ahaziah, and 2 Kings 23, King Josiah, and Judges. We get these ideas of kings coming together on the plains of Megiddo. Remember, there's no mountain. We see that the work of Satan through the Roman Empire and through its false religion of emperor worship that was happening especially in the 7 churches of Asia, or at least in that province. It wasn't happening within the church. But John is warning them that this is where the worship of Caesar began. And so these nations are going to dry up and fail. They might assemble for battle, but it's going to be a decisive loss for them and for Satan and for the Roman Empire. And the key is in verse 15 here. Let me read that. It says, "Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, so that he may not go about naked and be exposed." The key is verse 15. John is calling us, and he's calling the people of God to stay prepared. God's judgment will come like a thief. Be prepared. Stay awake. Don't be caught by surprise. And so the 7th angel pours out his bowl, and he makes this super important declaration. That is, it is done. It is done. Like, it's over. And there were flashes of lightnings and rumblings and peals of thunder and a great earthquake such as there had never been seen since man was on the earth. And great was the earthquake. The city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, of the Gentiles fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of wine of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. And great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God for the plague of hail, because the plague was so severe. The 7th angel pours out his bowl, and he says, it's done. The end has come for the world powers. God's cataclysmic wrath is coming to put an end to evil. And this great earthquake describes this desolation. And you might think, or we should think, let me put it this way, we should think in terms of a backpack. Let me get on a little bit of a rabbit trail here. We are all products of our context in our life. I can't pull out something that I don't know anything about and write it down. So if I have a backpack, John is pulling things out of his backpack that he knows. He pulls out, how are ancient cities destroyed, leveled to the ground? There's only a couple ways. They didn't have gunpowder. They didn't have explosives. It was either war or earthquakes. And that's the pictures that we see here in Revelation. And so when John describes these things, he's describing for us this desolation that happened in ancient cities. The great city falls, and the cities of the other nations fall. And God fulfills his promise, making the nations drink the cup of God's justice at full strength, not watered down. And so the empire has fallen. The devastation is great. And the people continue to curse God because of the plagues. So chapters 17 and 18 are now going to explain the details of this 7th bowl of judgment. And so the next 2 chapters are not images of new judgment, but are a fuller explanation of this new of this judgment, the 7th bowl, and how it will come and impact and the devastation that's going to come out of it. Now, there's a couple words. This is extra credit. This is not really necessarily part of the lesson, but I wanted to bring up 2 words that I found helpful over my time of study of the book of Revelation. And those 2 words are theopolitical and theopoetic. These are 2 different concepts. See, Revelation is a theopoetic book, but it's also a theopolitical text. And Revelation provides us with this magnificent and inspiring vision of the present and what the present actually looks like. But it also provides us this picture of the future reign of God through the slaughtered lamb of Christ, who is Christ. And John's words are a powerful critique against abusive power structures, whether in John's day or our day or in our children's day. It's a powerful critique against these power structures, against nations, and especially against civil religion. We're going to get into that next week, what civil religion is, because it's critical to understanding what's going on here. The worship of the nation is what John is specifically telling these people not to do. And so John's words are a challenge to these people. Stay awake. You need to follow the Lamb by living in a community of faithful resistance. That's a fancy way of saying become part of a church, right? A community of faithful resistance to the empire and to those power structures that are oppressive around us. And so Revelation was written to enable its hearers, the people who would hear it, right? Because vast majority of people are illiterate, so they are hearing the word. John wants them to renew their commitment to the Lamb so that they can be sustained in these times of oppression and persecution. John does that through a series of images and symbols that should not be overinterpreted. And so John uses this as a theopolitical text to show us that God is king. He's not president. He's not elected. He is king. He is the creator. And we need to worship him. But it's also a theopoetic text. And so when we read it, we need to be careful and look for the meaning behind it and not look for atoms and molecules and how to build the house. We need to look for the meaning behind the house. How do we make this a home? How do we make this text of Revelation our home? How do we understand it and apply it in our own lives? That's what poetry does for us. It touches something that can't be touched in a physical sense. I think above all, the details of the symbolism here in Revelation should not be handled as if Revelation was some sort of a script that we're going to pick up one day and see the details of the end of history. In fact, quite the opposite, right? We're promised that we won't know the day or the hour. But Revelation shows us the details of how to serve God in and I'm not sure the right word to use here, so I'm going to use the word liturgical. So through our life, we live out church. Church is not something you go to and do a certain number of 5 acts, right? What John is describing here for us is a way of life. But it's also over our lives. And it's good to have everyone here this morning. Next week, we'll look at chapter 17. I think we'll only do 17 next week because there's a lot of little details in there. If you have any comments or questions, you can send them to sitkachurch@gmail.com if you're listening online, or you can swing by the building here in town. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. All right.